Okay, there we go. I was trying to find the right button to get things started here. I'm sorry. This is Bill Baker at Firestorm. We're pleased to have you joining us for this webinar today. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented with the sponsorship of the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools. We're pleased to have them as our co-host and sponsor and underwriter of this series of Crisis Coach webinars. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch previous webinars of this series, and you can also register for future webinars. We'd also like to have you be our friend. Firestorm Solutions on Facebook and Firestorm Soul on Twitter. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd like to remind you, though, that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. And this work product must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. And this information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. We're so pleased to have the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools as our underwriter. This topic today is communication breakdown. It's always the same. Our presenter is going to be Jim Satterfield, who is the president of Firestorm, and he will be also appearing next spring, with a meeting in your neck of the woods in Tennessee. Our moderator today is our good friend Rich Martin, and I believe that both Joe Royka and Rich Martin are on with us today. Rich, over to you for some comments.
Thank you, Bill. Well, welcome everyone to this 11th in the series of Crisis Coach webinars. This is valuable information that we're very delighted to be collaborating with Firestorm and bringing to you. Yes, I do want to say something about, before we go on, we've just completed our last event other than one more Firestorm webinar on the 10th of December, our last event for 2015. However, we've got some great things coming in 2016, and I do want you to be aware that among them are not only the Crisis Coach workshop in Nashville on the 3rd of March. We're going to have a strategic planning for independent schools workshop on the 1st of March, also in Nashville. And in April, we're going to have a mini conference for communications and admissions people and the Tech Institute, which will be coming on the 25th of April. If you are in a position to encourage faculty and staff to submit proposals for either the Tech Institute or the 2016 Biennial Conference, those are things that are going to be opening up in the next few weeks. Thank you, and back to Bill.
Thank you, Rich. Our presenter today, as I mentioned, is Jim Satterfield, President, Chief Operating Officer, and co-founder of Firestorm. Jim, over to you, please.
Well, Rich and Jill and Bill, thanks for being with us today and for everyone who's listening. And we've enjoyed the webinar series and sharing some thoughts. And today, obviously, as the theme you've heard, is to talk about communications breakdown. It's always the same. In crisis communications, the sensitivity is of those communications becomes extremely critical. And we find that the same problems are repeated over and over again. And so we look at what's worked and what's not worked, and some common themes come out, and we're going to explore those today in our conversation. First is that if you don't have a plan, it's going to be very difficult for you. So you need to have a crisis communications plan in advance, have everyone be aware of it. We'll talk about message mapping and having those messages thought out so that someone is just not speaking off the cuff at a time there. And finally, training to know how to deliver it and what's going to happen. So we're going to take you a little bit behind the scenes today and focus on this theme and give you some insights and things that you can immediately start to do. So where do you start? you've got to identify what are the potential crises that your school could face. And you may have done a good job about a vulnerability analysis or a hazard matrix review of the natural disaster perils that you're facing in your school. It could be winter storms or flooding. It could be a tornado. It could be an active shooter. In each of those areas, communicable illness. But as you think through all of the risk and threats that you have, then you should similarly think about what would we communicate? What would we communicate before the event? What would we communicate during the event? And what would we communicate after the event? And so planning those communications out in advance will make a big difference for you as you identify those crises.
All right.
Rich, I think your mic still might be open, or Bill or Jill, because I'm picking up a little feedback at that point. So you need to be able to focus on what those crises are, and then that will be a place where you'll start to determine what your messages will be. And we'll go into much more depth on that subject and creating a predictive, actionable intelligence network to be able to figure out what's going on and what's being said within your school community and how that would relate to who you are and what you need to do. So now let's assume something that's occurred. Why is crisis communication so critical? And we remember out of World War II the line about loose lips sink ships, and the concern there was a casual comment made by someone. The enemy might be listening, and they'd know where your loved one was, and that could lead to an attack. But in a crisis, loose lips can certainly do more than sink ships. They can destroy the brand and reputation of a school. They can create liability for your school or bring harm or injury as a result of those activities. So here's the first tip that we want to give you today, the first rule. If you find yourself in a crisis and those around you are saying, we need to get in front of this thing, we need to be getting out there and talking about it, we've got to frame the conversation, I want you to stop and ask why. And I want you to ask that why question 5 times. When there's a crisis and someone says, we got to get our message out, you want to stop and say, why? And they'll give you an answer. And then you ask them again, why? And then they give you an answer, and you ask that again. Until you've gone through that 5 times, you shouldn't be making a message. In many cases, people are trying to talk about the wrong things at the wrong time. And almost everything you learn initially in this crisis is wrong. And you're going to be forced to make decisions and communications based upon that wrong information. Invariably, we find that people go out and start to talk about what they want to be true instead of what really occurred because they don't understand it yet. So stopping and asking this why will help focus that conversation. It's the same way that when a small child, you tell them not to do something and they say, why? And then you give a rationale and then they ask that again and again. And I know it's sometimes easy to get upset with a 5 or 6-year-old to continually ask you that question, why? But we really are trying to slow everything down in this crisis. Emotions are running high. People are concerned. There's a lot of pressure, and you will hear repeatedly, our school is different than any other school. You don't understand our parents. You don't understand what we're trying to do. And it really is the same as we focus in each one of these areas. Legally, there are things that you cannot talk about. You cannot talk about one student and mention them by name to another family or to other students. You can't talk about a specific teacher and what you did in that particular area. Now let's assume that there was something inappropriate that a teacher had done and you had made a decision that you were going to terminate that teacher. And someone was coming back, well, did you do a background check on Mr. Smith? And you cannot say yes or no, but what you can say is, well, I can't talk about any particular teacher. I can tell you at our school we have a policy of doing background checks on all teachers prior to hiring. That's a way that you could get your message out without talking about that specific teacher. By the way, annual background checks are the standard and best practice in the industry. So if you did a background check when you hired that teacher 5 years ago, then you might want to make sure that's updated and there has been no change in the information. So the objective is to understand and establish why you're communicating at this particular time. And so you have to measure the value of making the statement versus the liability or threat that it could mean to the school. And so that's the first rule that we want to have. So you are on this webinar today. Somebody said, hey, the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools is doing a webinar on crisis communications and how they break down. Here's the first point. You need to go back to them and say, when we need to communicate in our school, we've got to stop and ask why 5 times and plan through that. Now, as you think through this, we want you to, the second is to predict, plan, perform methodology. You've got to understand of whatever's occurred, what's the impact going to be of that? How will we monitor to see if that's in fact going on? What's the trigger that would cause us now to have to make a communication? And we view that not only in terms of just our students, but our teachers, and view it from the parents' perspective as we plan that. So the first portion of crisis communication is predict what you anticipate to happen next. Then you would develop your plan. We will go through and talk about home bases and message maps in just a minute, but you'd be planning that together and figure out the medium that you'd be sending those communications. And then finally you perform. You would send the text message, you'd make the PA announcement, you'd do the interview, you would send a phone, you'd make a phone call, you'd send out an email, you'd post a statement on your website. But it's when you would do that execution and control it. So what you would find is there's always going to be a rush to try to get in front of something. And that's going to be extremely difficult. And one of your jobs as you're focused on crisis communications is to slow that down a little bit and let everybody get on the same page. Ask them why, go through this predict, plan, perform process, and then your communications probability will accelerate. Now, as we break that down and we're focusing on the predictive work and we know what's going to occur, who is the audience that you want to communicate to? The words that we use in your lower school might be different than the words we use in your upper school. Reaching out to parents might be different. Reaching out to donors might be different within those areas. We want to focus on what their concerns are as we plan. So we would predict those areas in advance. Then we tailor that message, who is going to deliver it, the messenger, and the media, and that could be medium or modality, that you're going to be sending that message out. Are we going to put it in writing? And once we put it in writing, we know it's going to be there forever, and it could get into the hands of third parties. If we're going to be saying it orally, who's going to be delivering it? What hour of training have they had? And we want to format that plan and that message to the individual stakeholder. And then focus on our 3 key messages. What's the first message that we're going to give? What's the second? And what's the third? You're not going to be able to give a long 1-hour sermon and respond to this. You're going to need to break it down and give very succinct messages and specifically. Now, when we're going through this predict, plan, perform approach, there are going to be 3 types of communications that you would do. One type of communication is a coordination communication. That would generally be internally. What is it that you need people to do? Now, the standard protocol of lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuate, there are specific actions and directions you want students and teachers to do. If you've had a problem, then you may have a reunification plan in place to be able to match the students and the parents after the crisis. And so those are coordination communications, and generally in a crisis, the first communications you give are going to be done with in that manner. The second category is crisis communications. They're related to the brand and reputation of your school. What are the themes that you want to get out? What are the key messages that you need to deliver in those particular areas? Those are generally external. They need to have a great deal of thought because of the implications that they're going to have. And in many cases, if you're trying to communicate to your parents, you might want to put that message up on your website. That way, if the media gets it, they're having to quote it exactly and not their interpretation. The third type of communication is a compliance communication. You may be required from a regulatory standpoint to make certain communications. If you become aware of a child that is a victim of domestic violence or sexual molestation, or that there's a threat associated with it, you have a compliance responsibility to make those reports. We also see it in the area of cyber breach. There's a great deal of information you have about your students and their families. You may have financial information about that family. You may have behavioral information or health information about a student or a teacher. And if you are breached, then there's going to be certain notification requirements that you have to do from a compliance perspective on that. By the way, we are going to be doing next month an open virtual exercise for cyber breach. Now, it's not designed specifically for schools. It will be a mixed audience of schools and businesses, and right now there are 1,000 companies that will be attending it. It'll be on December the 8th or on December the 14th at 2 o'clock Eastern. That's a good time to sit down and go through what it's like to go through a cyber breach and to look at the business impacts associated with that. It's a key factor, and remember that that event is a business event. It is not an IT event, because it's what is the impact on our brand and reputation at our school. So I understand the approach, Jim. I've got this predict, plan, perform stuff down. Why is it so hard to do this? If you look at the descriptions that you see up on the screen now, this is the environment in which we find ourselves in a crisis. The events are going to be escalating. We're going to have insufficient, inaccurate, or completely wrong information. And you're going to be forced to make a decision based upon that bad information. And you're going to be forced in this stage to make a communication, and that's going to be very difficult. So we're going to give you some tools that will help you in that area and some ways that you can plan those communications when you don't know all the facts and some of the information that you already have is wrong. Remember, you're going to be under intense scrutiny. There's a loss of command and control generally in a crisis, and how you respond will determine if there's going to be a repeat or a follow-up or even a second crisis to this. You're under attack from a brand and reputation. How could you let this happen at your school? What controls did you have in those areas? But keep in mind that it's always a human crisis. This one is someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's father. And so having that understanding becomes extremely critical. And it comes to you as a surprise. I tell often that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it was my birthday. If you're at school and there's a crisis and it comes to you as a surprise, it's not going to be a good day. It's going to be a bad day. So what's the process? First, stop. Factually assess the situation. Determine if we have to make a communication right now or ever. There are many of these things that we may not make a broad, overarching statement. We may only wait and answer questions when they come to us from parents or students. But if we are going to communicate, we then have to identify who we're going to talk to. Who are our key audiences? Is it the parents? Is it the large donors? Is it our students? Who are each of those offices? And then we align those messages that we send out to the key audiences. And you see it's listed here as pre-written messages. We're going to talk about creating message maps in just a moment so that you have initial drafts for the types of exposures that you see, and then you can edit them at the time of the crisis. You certainly will go ahead and monitor the events that are going on. You have to be listening to social media. That's going to tell you of what is happening out there, and you may have it wrong. Or there may be a rumor or a misconception that's out there that you're going to have to address to minimize from those comments. And if you're not conducting that listening and looking campaign, you're going to find yourself at a significant disadvantage. You want to conduct debriefs with your team at every step along the way. What's working? What's not working? What do we need to update? How do we need to shift and change our strategy at this particular point? And ask for assistance. You may need to bring in an outside party. You may want to check with legal counsel of what you can and cannot talk with at this point. And we want to make sure that every message supports our mission in terms of who our school is and what we stand for. So that's the process. So how do you know when to communicate? Jim, there's a lot of things going on, and I think we ought to get out there. I would encourage you to look at the events and create an event activation matrix. And if you need help with that, that's an opportunity for Firestorm to team with your school. And to take a look at different categories of things that would happen. Describe what's a minor event, an incident, and then a full-blown business crisis that would affect our entire school and our image of who we are. So you would identify that event. What's the action and the message that you would want to give? Who's responsible for it? And this will help you determine, when you look across those three levels, that here it is, it's only a minor event, we're not going to communicate. Here it is, it's a major event, it affects our entire school and who we are. We have no choice, but we have to communicate at that point in time. So we want to sit down and design this event activation matrix when there's not a crisis going on, when we're not in the middle of a stampede of what do we do and when do we do it, and how do we pull it together. That's going to become extremely critical so that everybody is on the same page. So you're not being second guessed. Well, why didn't we post something on our website? Why did you send that message? You shouldn't have sent that message. Everybody understands in advance of what our strategy is. Now, there's a cycle in communications, and this could easily say at the top, crisis communications cycle, as well as just the plain communication. Notice the word, though, after cycle. It's the word control. Command and control in a crisis are generally two of the most important elements that are there. So we first, if we don't have an event going on, we're doing information gathering. We'll talk about home bases and message maps and themes in just a minute, but if you're in a middle of a crisis, you want to figure out what happened. You want to get as much of that information as you can together. You would draft and then edit whatever your message would be, and that's why we encourage you to take a look at all the potential vulnerabilities and threats and plan this out in advance so that you could be in an edit mode, because it's easier to edit than it is to create. Also, if you're directly involved in the problem and it's your students in your school, it's easy to become emotional, and that makes this much more difficult. But even if you had all these home bases and message maps laid out, don't just immediately say, okay, let's send it, let's say it, let's do it. You need to get approval, and that's why it's very important, and I put the word key out there so you wouldn't miss it. I want you, even if you've got pre-approved messages or an understanding, that everybody needs to understand we now are going to release this message, because you don't want to have these going out prematurely, and you don't want to have them going out with what you would like to be true. We need to be able to keep to that base of what we know. And one general rule, the shorter the message, the better you will be. So once it's been written and edited and then approved for release, then you would go through your distribution. And this could be a text message, an email. It could be a phone call. It could be an interview. It could be a posting on your website. It could be a press release. Normally, I would post an open letter on the website as opposed to a press release. Or you could even do a press conference. Very seldom would there ever be a situation that I'd recommend to an independent school in the state of Tennessee to hold a press conference. The manipulation factor there would be very great, and the exposure to your school would be very difficult to control. We want to make sure that we are controlling your message at those times. And the external monitoring. Is your message getting out? What's being said about it? Is it being understood? I think all of us are following the events at the University of Missouri that have been going on over the last several weeks. And if you look at that pattern, there's many of those communications where there was significant failure, and it's exacerbated the problem and really created to disenfranchise many of the people that are involved. So how do you know what's being said or heard? You know, Jim, I understand what I know, but how do I know if my message got through? And what happens is that if there's a significant event, and just before the call, we were talking about 2015 in the state of Tennessee, and fortunately we haven't had any major schools, independent schools, with crises this year. In Georgia, we've responded to 3 schools this year, and one of those schools twice with 2 different events that in fact occurred. So it's been a good year for you. Our hope and prayer is that it finishes the year out that way. but obviously this brings attention. Now, the statistics are that if people know, they talk, and where people talk today is on social media. So there are two tools, one that looks at what's being said, looks at streams and phrases and words and issues, and then gives you the ability to establish this baseline. So suddenly if there's a surge of communications, you would know, and you could be able to tell. And the other tool is one that goes and looks at particular persons of interest or events or a geocode around a particular location to map those things out. But you need to have the baseline established so that when some crisis does occur, you can monitor that and be able to determine what's happened. So if you don't have a particular predictive intelligence solution within your school, that will go a long way to help your communications if you find yourself in those events. Anonymous reporting is another element within that particular area. So, and then these reports need to go back to your crisis management team so they can see how their actions are being perceived and how people are reacting in those particular areas. If you want to know more about predictive intelligence, you can go and listen to some of the recorded webinars where we've broken that down into much more detail. So let's think again a minute about this crisis communications and the various components that are associated with it. First of all, if there's ever an event, you're certainly going to express concern and support and offer condolences at every step through the process. We are not going to be explaining about what happened, because if we're explaining, we're losing, and also in most cases we will not be able to release information because of confidentiality requirements. If you bring in a crisis manager to assist, or a firm that's going to help you in this direction, I would recommend that you have them retained through the school's outside counsel or general counsel in contemplation of litigation, because generally a crisis event, there will be litigation involved in it, and we would like to try to establish attorney-client privilege, because as the investigations and events are created, you don't know what you're going to find. And a great many times you're going to find that something occurred that you wish had not occurred. Third, we're going to always tell the truth. We're not going to lie. The cover-up and lie is going to be significantly worse and exacerbate the crisis very aggressively, and so we're going to tell the truth. Now, we may not come out and make a full statement on the first day because we don't know the truth at this point. We don't have the full understanding and comprehension. And so that's where it helps us that if we have some themes and messages that we call home bases, and I'm going to hit these 3 things 4 times in today's webinar. Translation is, this part's important. First is, you would say that will not be defined by this event. Whatever bad thing that happened, that's not what your school is about. Your school is about providing for educational growth, growth from an athletic standpoint, growth from a moral standpoint, growth from a faith standpoint, growth from a good citizenship standpoint. That's what our school is about. It's not about whatever this bad thing was. Second, that you're going to invent the future, that you're going to take a look at this and make whatever changes and policies and controls in place to assure that it won't happen again. And so you want to talk about the future. And then finally, that you're going to embrace the families. It's about someone's son or daughter or mother or father. That's going to be the issue, and you want to have that come through loud and clear. You'll notice none of those themes said, we're going to tell you what happened. Because in many cases, legally you can't. In most cases, you don't know. And if there is a problem, and if there is a police investigation or a fire investigation within it, let the authorities talk about the problem. You're going to talk about the solution. Now, we're going to focus on the why communicate. Remember the rule of 5 that I gave you earlier? You're going to stop, and when somebody says, we need to talk, you then need to say, why? And until you've answered that 5 times and had answers that satisfy you, we're not going to communicate. Now, the up and down is talking about internally and externally and what we say and when we say it. Our internal communications are divided into those 3 buckets that I gave you earlier: coordination, crisis, or compliance. We're going to deal within those types of areas. If we're talking externally and it's that crisis area, that's the brand and reputation of our school, and we want to be extremely careful there. Remember here, it's about the listener or the reader. It's not about you. So whoever's hearing, whoever's reading that statement that you posted on the internet, that becomes an important element for you within that process. Now, home bases. That's the three that I gave you. Will not be defined by the event. We're going to invent the future. We're going to embrace the families. So they're well thought out. It's a safe place to go. When you get asked that question and you don't know the answer to it, instead of saying no comment, which the public generally interprets it that you did something wrong and there's a cover-up, it will empower you to answer those questions, and they're developed during the planning cycle when you think about crisis communication. If you haven't done it and you find yourself, oh, I'm right in the middle of a crisis, I've got to have something to say, go to your website and look and see what defines you in your school. So, for example, the 3 home bases, again, at Virginia Tech after the shootings, this is the third time I've mentioned it. We will not be defined by this event. We'll invent the future. We'll embrace the families. We'll talk about this at least once more in today's webinar. Our experience is that these bases can be customized and talk about any crisis and give you a safe harbor that you can deliver those messages. If you haven't written them down yet, write these 3 down. We'll not be defined by the event. We'll invent the future, and we'll embrace the families. So what does that mean? What does define your school? Go to your home page, and it talks about your mission or your beliefs and what you're associated with. And so you want to be able to clearly explain what does define our school. Just as you're talking in the admission process to some parents who want to know should their son or daughter come to your school, how do you describe who your school is and what it stands for? That's what you would want to deal and answer on that. Because it's not the event that occurred. It's not the fire. It's not the active shooter. It's not the sexual molestation. That's not what's defining your school. You're defining your school as what you've stood for all these years. You're going to invent the future. You're going to make sure that this doesn't happen again. You're going to put in better oversight, better controls, better procedures to fix so that this problem won't be out. Well, what happened? Then you're going to direct people back to the authorities. And again, you will not be able to talk about specifics about a student or a teacher. And last, though, that you want to embrace the families, that you're going to reach out to support those that were directly impacted. It's very easy if you put your focus here now because nothing, in fact, is going on. Now, message maps are the next portion, and that's where we stop to think about what are the questions we could be asked? What do we say? And so they're clear, concise statements so that if here's the question, here's my first answer to the question, here's my second, and here's my third. I don't give all 3 at one time. So if you're asked the question, I give my first answer and I shut up. If they ask a follow-up question, then I give the second, and then I'm silent. And then if they ask the third, I give the final answer that I have to that particular question. And generally these answers are a sentence, maybe 2 at most, to give that particular answer in that area. If you've exhausted your message map 3 statements, then you go back to your home base because that gives you that opportunity. It's the most powerful way that you can make sure that you're saying what needs to be said at this point in time and not something that later you'll regret of what occurs. So when you think about these message maps, identify what you most want that target audience to know. What is it you want your upper class students to know? What do you want to have your lower class students know? What about your middle school associated with that? What about parents? What about the public? What about the media? Identify what you need to do to correct any misconceptions or perceptions or erroneous information. Now remember, if somebody doesn't like you, they're not going to believe you. And so they will not process the information. But we have to know what is out there, and that's where that intelligence network becomes so very critical. Prepare the 3 messages that you can communicate, your core overall talking points. And then these support message maps really give you more detail if you have to go into it. Again, short and simple. Less is certainly more here. And if you have them all written out, not that you're going to be reading them, but it gives you a chance to learn that. And lastly, practice delivery. When we respond to a crisis and someone says, oh, I don't need media training, but they do, generally the person who says that is the person who needs that media training, because it's a completely different environment today. The media is not about getting it right. They're about creating controversy and getting more people viewing in practice. I would also recommend that as you practice your emergency drills, active shooter, armed intruder, those types of things, that you practice what the messages would be as a part of your tabletop exercise. In the first quarter, we're going to do an active shooter response exercise. It's a 90-minute event. It's free, and I would recommend that you attend that both from a messaging and having your emergency team be a part of it. So if you're laying your message maps out, what's the concern or question? What's the impact? What's the stakeholder? And we might repeat this once for each one of those stakeholder groups. The first message, the second, and the third, and the medium that you're going to communicate it. This will allow you to put a structured environment in place to be able to carry your messaging out. You can see laying this out in a big, long table gives the ability that you could immediately go to it. You might have to edit it, but it is significantly easier to edit that message than trying to create it when you're under the stress that your school or your students have been the ones that have been exposed to this crisis. So taking the time to walk through this in advance, getting the leadership of your school to sign off, yes, we're comfortable with that. But do remember that that approval on the circular chart that I gave you very early in the presentation, that you want to be able to have them approve the actual release of the information at that time. So planning this out, look at all the vulnerabilities and threats that you have identified. We've had problems in schools across the country this year with child pornography on school computers. We've had problems with cameras in restrooms. We've had problems with sexual molestation and trips and travel and inappropriate contact. We've had violence, student-on-student violence associated with it. We've seen domestic violence come into a school. We've seen severe weather and tornadoes. We've had infectious and communicable disease outbreaks. It's been a busy year in the school world and focused on those particular areas. But many of those are predictable. Not the day that it's going to occur, but the fact that it could. So think about what your message would be and plan those answers now, not at that particular time. Now, as you think about this, I've shared it before, but to say again, everything you learn in the first 24 hours is wrong. So your actions and your words will be driven by facts that are going to later turn out to be incorrect. And so it's easy to make the right decision. It's easy to make the right statement when you know everything. But remember, as these events unfold quickly, you won't have that type of control to understand. And you're going to be, in many cases, forced to choose between here's a bad choice and there's a bad choice. Which one do you want to do? My grandfather had a line about which would you rather have or whipping. Well, you know what? That's pretty clear. I think I can figure out, Granddad, I'll take the one that's not the whipping. That's pretty good. In this situation, though, it's going to be much more complex. There are going to be options, but they're both going to be bad, or multiple of them will be bad, and your communications have to be planned. Now, why is this so very important? Because while the first 24 hours, everything you find is wrong, the following years, you'll be dealing with the consequences. This will be something that will be defining who your school is and what it stands for. You'll be amazed at how years later, oh, you're the school that, and then they insert the story and the events that were happening as a result of it. So planning this out in advance with this in mind about the consequences will make an important difference in the outcome for your school and what the impact and value will be. Now, I showed you a version of the slide earlier, except it has the loose lip, sink ship comments on it. I want to come back. This is probably, along along with the 3 common messages not defined by the event, invent the future, embrace the family, is the most important takeaway for you to have from our conversation today. I want you to ask why when someone comes and says, you know, we need to get in front of this and get our message out. Our school's different. You don't understand who our families are, what our community is. Until you establish why you're communicating by asking that 5 times, do not communicate. The value of the communications must be weighed against what its impact and exposure and even legal liability that it could create for your school. If you're the voice of reason when others are emotional that it was their students, it was their families that were involved, this will start to change that perspective if you'll stop and ask this 5 times. So this point, one of the tools you have in your quiver, in addition to planning the messages out in advance, is your ability to ask why. So as we think about what you've done, and you've looked at your hazards and all hazards approach or the vulnerability and risk, you want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. We've done several webinars where we talked about predictive intelligence. If you want to go back and listen to those or get the briefs, those are free and you can get them off of our website. So I would encourage you to do that. But you have to have an intelligence network within your school, or you're going to find yourself consistently surprised and at a significant disadvantage, and you really can't afford not to. So that's one of the things that you should be carrying back to the school and talk about what's our intelligence network look like. I would recommend that you participate in a virtual exercise with your team. I mentioned that we'll be announcing dates in the first quarter about an active shooter test exercise so that you can go through that with your team. On December the 8th and the December 14th, there's going to be a choice. You can attend either if you would like, and it's at 2 p.m. Eastern, which would be 1 p.m. your time, and that's going to be a cyber breach exercise. That is a business problem that could happen to a school, and it would be an area that you need to address it. Now, this will be a mixed audience. We'll have both schools and businesses involved in it because the impact could happen to both organizations. And it's not an IT problem. It's a business problem for your school. You want to make sure your plans align to best practices. If you want an assessment of your plans, we're glad to do so. You want to design that intelligence network. You also want to think about getting your plans put on smart devices, onto the smartphone, instead of having a binder, because today we're no more than 3 feet away, and then schedule some training for your school. There will be a brief about today's story about what's going on here, and this is one from the one last month about the first crisis, but this brief is going to be about communications breakdown, and you can go to our website and download that brief. Our thanks to the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools. And Rich, is there something you want to say as we start to wind down today?
Thanks, Jim. I just have a couple things. Just specifically want to remind people of the events coming up. The TAIS is doing in January, at the beginning of the next calendar year, second half of the school year. January 13th, athletic directors and coaches workshop conducted by Mike Elson, who's an athletic CPA. It will be at CPA. January 20th, a workshop, an important one, on curriculum unit planning using the Understanding by Design model. That will be run by Kim Marshall of the Marshall Memo, and a fellow who's been doing a lot of work with supervision and evaluation teachers. That will be at FRA. And on the 27th and 28th, we'll be having roundtable discussions for 27th middle and upper school heads, and 28th early childhood and lower school heads. The former at CPA, and then the one on the 28th at Harding. And these will be an opportunity for heads of schools, division heads rather, to talk about issues of concern, and we'll kick those off with a discussion of Kim Marshall and work on teacher supervision and evaluation and how that works and what the good parts and the bad parts of it are. So these are things coming up immediately after Christmas. Don't let them slip away from your mind. Register for them now. Thanks a lot. Back to you, Jim.
Well, appreciate it, and I think the true value of membership in the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools is this networking and knowledge sharing. We all can grow, and we can all do better. If you've got questions, you can reach out to us at firestorm.com. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com. The telephone number here is 800-321-2219. Thank you for all that you've done in your school with your students this year. We'll focus on next year and have an editorial calendar. The Crisis Coach webinar series will continue. And remember those cyber exercises next month. Thanks, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving. Just around the corner. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.